Well, my dear, every year the kids in my town drastically change on their 18th birthday. Ethan Harley shouldn't have been crying at his own birthday party. Turning 18 was supposed to be a celebration, a rite of passage. My mom couldn't wait for my 18th birthday, and it was 2 weeks away. I was less than excited when I arrived at the party, hovering behind her. The party was in full swing, but it was the adults who were celebrating, while the birthday boy himself sat alone, his head buried in his lap. He was crying. I could tell by his shuddering shoulders, trying to bury himself in his lap and make himself smaller. Ethan's father greeted me with a rainbow cupcake and stroking my hair. I awkwardly laughed, shoving him away. "I'm 17, Mr. Harley." I was pretty sure he still saw me as a child. Mr. Harley was like an uncle to me. He loomed over me at an impressive and slightly intimidating height, dark red hair slicked back, always wearing brightly colored pants and long trench coats. According to my mother, Ethan's dad was the only one who could stop me from crying when I was a baby, pretending my screams were lyrics to a song he liked, which cemented my nickname. Personally, I just think my infant self was so confused by him singing over my screams that I immediately stopped. "Hello, Ruby Songbird," he laughed, ruffling my hair again. I inched away. "Still 17. Dylan." My mom's face crinkled into a smile. "Congratulations." Mr. Harley nodded with a grin, his gaze flicking to me. I didn't notice, mesmerized by the huge cake sitting on a metal platter. I didn't see Ethan's name on it, though. The little kids were running around while the adults stood in their own little groups, holding champagne glasses and whispering to each other. I noticed they kept shooting glances at Ethan, who had moved to the backyard, now sitting on the edge of their pool. Mr. Harley was quick to usher me away so he could talk to my mom. "All right, my little songbird, why don't you take this to my mopey son?" He chuckled, handing me a bowl of ice cream, gesturing to Ethan. "I think he needs cheering up." I took the ice cream with a nervous laugh. What's wrong with him?" Mr. Harley's lips twitched, and he and my mother shared a smile. I was expecting a slightly passive-aggressive explanation to why my age group were all bad, and that's exactly what I got. Mr. Harley nudged Mom playfully, his gaze snapping back to me. "It's an illness that only affects teenagers, turning them into evil monsters who refuse to do what their parents say." He held out the ice cream, covering it with chocolate sauce. "Right now, this is the only cure we have. Ethan prefers vanilla, but one bowl of this and I'm sure his symptoms will clear up." I shot Mom a pained look, and she nudged me a little too hard, so I took the ice cream. "Yeah, sure, I'll give him his cure." Mom's smile was a warning. "Do not push it." I had to resist the urge to outwardly cringe. Ethan's father was a lot. Ethan himself used to be a great guy. We grew up together, bonding over our birthdays only being 2 weeks apart, so it was always me and him. He was the boy next door, the two of us growing up facing each other's windows. He was that freckled, awkward little kid, and then he made my stomach kind of flutter. We started junior high hand in hand, promising to stay friends forever. Yeah, that lasted maybe 2 fucking minutes. Boys and puberty don't mix. Suddenly, he was drawing his curtains and blocking me out. I called him out, of course, and to my surprise, he apologized for being an asshole. We reconciled and our friendship groups merged together. But over the last few months, Ethan stopped knocking on my door and ignored me when I shouted his name across the street. When I texted his friends and then my friends, I got no answer. Look, I was already a little weirded out by the sudden dramatic change in behavior in some of my classmates when they reached the big 18. Jesse Radcliffe and Eris Mora, Ethan's friends, were the latest casualties. In the space of 2 weeks, the two of them had turned from obnoxious jocks to, I wasn't even sure. Was there a word for a complete change in personality/behavior? These guys used to spend their Friday nights in the diner, drinking beers and trying to hit on the 20-year-old waitress. Now, from what I heard, they stayed inside and watched English golf. Whatever happened to them, it freaked Ethan out. He stopped returning my calls and just went totally silent. At school, he shoved past me, completely ignoring my existence. Ethan's mother called it typical teenage behavior when he and a group of guys from school tried to run away from home. They were caught, and ever since then, Ethan had become a different person. He told me to fuck off a week prior, and I didn't like the sudden hollowness in his eyes. Ethan didn't look happy on his happy day, and part of me wasn't surprised. But hey, it was his 18th, he should have been at least forcing a smile. When his mother gently pulled him into the house to join in on the birthday song, he reluctantly dragged himself inside, rolling his eyes the whole time. I noticed him playing with a keychain, a little Pokemon attached to it, his fingers wrapping around and squeezing it for dear life. I was pretty sure it was a gift from Eris. Speaking of, he was keeping his distance for some reason, hanging out with all the parents. I did catch looks between them. Ethan, glaring at his friend, and Eris, grinning back at him, saluting his birthday with his glass of whiskey. Didn't Eris hate the stuff? I vaguely remembered him throwing up on my sneakers during a summer camp out. When Ethan was told to blow out his candles, the boy refused, and to my surprise, violently shoved his mother away when she tried to pull him into a hug. Mrs. Harley looked hurt, but she maintained her smile. Ethan. Her tone was still gentle, despite her strained grin. Baby, blow out your candles and thank everyone for coming. Ethan didn't move, his face bathed in warm candlelight. I tried to meet his eyes, but he refused to look at me. I was only met with empty darkness, and a stranger with my best friend's face. No, he whispered, wrapping his arms around himself. Ethan's response was met with low murmurs in the crowd. Young man, Mr. Harley spoke up this time, his smile stretching a little too thin. Ethan's tone terrified me. He lifted his head, glaring at his parents. It's not my fucking birthday. I tried not to notice Jessie smirking at the corner of my eye. Ethan's mother burst into tears, and my own eyes started to sting. Ethan, Mr. Harley chastised. Apologize to your mother. The boy stood very still for a moment, before a smile slowly pricked on his lips. I saw his body relax, his shoulders slumping. His fingers twined around the keychain went limp, and he stuffed it in his pocket. You're right, Mom. Ethan smiled brightly, but there were tears in his eyes. When Ethan was caught running away from home, he freaked out, trying and failing to hide the conflicting emotions. This time, he let the tears fall, soaking the collar of his shirt. But he was still smiling. Thanks for the cake, Mom, he said, before plucking a still-lit candle from the frosting and dropping it into his mouth. Luckily, Mr. Harley forced him to spit it out. Relax. Ethan laughed. Wow, guys. It's almost like you don't want me to hurt myself. Mrs. Harley was still trying to smile, her eyes wild. Ethan, stop. Stop what? The birthday boy surprised me with a grin, his gaze meeting mine. What's wrong, Mom? Isn't this what you've always wanted? He started cramming candles into his mouth in a frenzy, choking on them. But that didn't stop him trying to stuff more down his throat. They were quickly taken away. After a very brief hissing match with his parents, he saluted them with a rebellious grin, grabbed the cake, and planted his face directly into rainbow frosting before collapsing into hysterical giggles. There was a stunned silence, and I think both of his parents were on the edge of their tether before the crowd, mainly the adults, started laughing, leaving me the only one who wasn't. Jessie and Eris were howling, the two of them slapping their thighs like this was comedy genius. A shiver slowly slithered down my spine. Ethan was sobbing. Through his violent laughter, tears running down his cheeks, choking him. He shot his father a wide grin, licking frosting from his lips and chin. I thought you wanted me to celebrate my birthday? The boy danced over to the cupcakes, stuffing them into his mouth. I'm having a great time. I started forwards to stop him, but my mother, who was joining in with the cacophony of shrieking laughter, yanked me back. It's not our business, Ruby, Mom said, shoving a drink in my face. Sweetie, have a drink. I don't think any of us were expecting Ethan to pour the entirety of the chocolate fountain over his head, which set the kids around me into fits of hysterical laughter. Please ignore our son, Mr. Harley told the crowd. He's just being a typical teenager. The crowd laughed louder, and something slimy crept up my throat. Ethan was self-destructing, and I couldn't bear watching. I turned to Mom to ask if I could leave, but she was already talking to Ethan's friends, her lips brushing the edge of a wine glass. There were several things wrong with what I was seeing, and I remember trying to swallow down soda that was creeping back up my throat. Mom didn't usually talk to the older kids. I remember her telling me to stay away from Jesse and Eris, both of whom she was now deep in conversation with. When Ethan ran away from home, Jesse and Eris were caught along with him. I wasn't supposed to be watching out of my window, but I did. I saw a very heated conversation between my mother and the two boys. Something about staying away from me and leaving Ethan alone. The last time I saw them, the two were standing on our front lawn throwing bricks at our door. Now, however, it seemed like Mom was friends with them. Jesse kept nudging her like they were best pals, while Eris swirled wine around his glass. I couldn't make out their words, but they kept stealing glances at Ethan and whispering to each other. Jesse and Eris didn't seem like the gossiping types, but somehow they looked comfortable with the adults, exchanging greetings with other guests and laughing with my mother. They were even dressed weirdly, swapping casual hooded sweatshirts and jeans for more formal dress shirts and pants. Jesse's Converse were already dirty from walking around in the foliage. When they were caught by their parents, the three were clinging onto each other. Jesse and Eris were dragged away screaming, and Ethan was pulled back inside. Mom caught me peeking, and she was pissed. Now, the two boys barely even looked at Ethan, except shooting him judgmental glances over their wine glasses. When the party resumed, the music was cranked up, and nobody was paying attention to Ethan Harley except for me. My gut twisted, no matter how many times I tried to convince myself that everything was okay. I watched him, still smeared in frosting, hovering over what was left of his cake. He was rocking backwards and forwards, unsteady, and I saw it. His fingers twitched, and in one quick motion, he snatched up the abandoned cake knife. I didn't like his smile, the sudden sparkle in his eyes, like he was going to self-destruct even more. Mrs. Harley, however, was quick to pull the knife from his fingers, and his arms dropped to his sides, his expression crumpling. She was surprisingly gentle with him, wrapping her arms around him and leading him out into the backyard. Ethan plunked himself on the edge of the pool, ignoring his mother's attempts to talk to him. She gave him a towel and told him to wipe his face, and he didn't respond, throwing the towel into the pool. When Mrs. Harley rested a hand on his shoulder, the boy jerked away, and she gave up, leaving him alone. I decided to join him, dipping my toes in iridescent water, comforted by the cool temperature. "Ethan," I said. "Go away, Ruby," he grumbled. I shuffled slightly to the left. "What exactly are you doing?" Ethan surprised me with a sigh, tipping his head back and blinking at the blistering sun. "I'm trying to figure out how to inconspicuously drown myself in a kid's pool." "Oh," I kicked my legs in the water. "Sounds fun." Keeping my eyes on water sparkling under late afternoon sunlight, I offered Ethan the dessert, and to my surprise, he took it, offering me a watery smile. "Thanks, Ethan," I said again. I wasn't sure how to ask him what was going on with him, but I didn't need to. "I don't want to talk about it." He leaned back, his mouth pricking into a smile. "If I'm honest, I just want to enjoy the summer breeze on my face." He leaned over, tracing the water with his fingers. "Maybe go skinny dipping when the kids are gone." When he started spooning dessert into his mouth, I couldn't resist. "Sue, what did your candles taste like? Were they as tasty as you were expecting them to be?" Ethan's gaze was glued to his friends laughing with the adults. Jesse and Eris were embedded in a conversation with my mom, the three of them drinking coffee with the other parents. Ethan's lips curled in disgust, but I also saw hurt, like it hurt him to even look at them. "Like fucking rainbows, dude. Ignore them," I muttered. "They're being assholes." The boy turned to me, his eyes swollen red. "Don't say that." "What? That your best friends who abandoned you are complete fucking jerks?" I wasn't expecting him to hide his face, sniffling into his sweater sleeve. "You've got no idea what you're talking about," he said, his tone hardening. "Just go home." I tried to smile, but my stomach was twisting into knots. I started to get up, brushing myself down. "Well, happy birthday," he sighed, planting his cakey face in his lap. "I've told you, it's not my birthday." Ethan lifted his head, but he didn't look at me, his gaze somewhere else entirely, lost in the sinking rays of the dying sun. "It's my dad's." He shuffled closer, leaning his head on my shoulder. "Can you make me a promise, Ruby?" Sure." I felt my cheeks redden. "When we were little kids, Ethan asked me to marry him." I said, "Maybe when we're adults." Ethan was frowning at a pool floaty, his eyes turning impossibly dark, impossibly hollow. Something in my gut twisted, a sliver of ice cream creeping its way back up my throat. He reached out and grabbed my hand, squeezing my fingers. "Before you're 18, I want you to do something important," he said, his voice splintering. Ethan turned to me, his expression twisted with fright, with hopelessness I would never understand. I swallowed. "What's that?" Ethan shuffled away from me. "Can you die for me?" Ethan looked up at me. His eyes were red from crying. He was terrified, and I didn't know why. "No matter what happens, you have to promise me you will die before you turn 18. He held out his pinky for a pinky promise, just like when we were kids. I couldn't resist a laugh, but his expression was serious. "I'm sorry, what?" Ethan averted his gaze. His hands were trembling. "Do you want to know a secret?" "Not really," I muttered. "Look, I can understand that you're scared to turn 18, that it's a big age for responsibility and becoming an adult, but it's also still young." I shivered. "I'm not excited of the idea of leaving home and being a responsible adult either, but we all have to at some point." I was babbling, trying to hide that I was fucking terrified of what my friend was trying to say. I rested my head on his shoulder. I expected warmth, but he was so unnaturally cold. The sun was slowly eclipsed by clouds, and all the warmth was sucked from the air. It was suddenly so cold, an icy breeze violently blowing my hair back. I wrapped my arms around myself. "Just promise me you'll start seeing a therapist." I found myself staring into the pool, where the water suddenly didn't look so welcoming. "Therapy?" Ethan said it like a joke, tipping his head back. "Sure." Ethan, lifting my head, Lila Fabre was looming over him. Ever since her 18th birthday, Lila wasn't acting like herself either. Like the boys, a key member of our gang had turned from a signature potty-mouthed cheerleader to a stranger in the space of a single day. She grabbed him and yanked him to his feet. Instead of hanging around with Ethan, she had spent the afternoon drinking with the adults. She wasn't alone. Jesse and Eris had joined her. "What is the matter with you?" she hissed. "You can't talk to Ruby like that." Lila had this weird mother-like tone that was both jarring and frustrating. "I'm fine." I managed to choke out, aware we had an audience. Lila shook her head. "No, sweetie, what he said was uncalled for," she said, folding her arms. Ethan apologized to her. When he didn't respond, she tapped her foot. "Now, you're making a fool out of yourself, boy," Jesse said, shaking his head. Ethan looked paralyzed for a moment, staring at his friends, his lips parting like he was going to speak, before his expression crumpled. "Not her face," he whispered, his wild eyes snapping to all three of them, and then he was moving, stumbling back, his breaths coming out in sharp pants. "That's not fair." Ethan broke out into a sob. When he dropped to his knees, Lila started towards him. He shuffled back, terrified. "Ethan, get the Fuck away from me." Ethan's eyes found mine, and he sputtered out a laugh. "Do you remember our promise?" I didn't move. My hands were trembling by my sides. Ethan's parents were quick to grab and pull him to his feet, but he was laughing. "I told your daughter to die." He spat at my mother, struggling in his father's arms. "Because what's the alternative, Mrs. Chase?" Mom didn't respond, which made him laugh harder. Well, Ethan yelped when his arms were pinned behind his back. What is the fucking alternative? By now, the whole party was watching his breakdown. Mom pulled me into her arms when Ethan was dragged away, still screaming. I shoved her away, rattled by his words. What's he talking about, Mom? Mom didn't respond for a moment. Her lips pursed. He is clearly mentally unwell. Answer me. His wails were like knives stabbing into my spine, his violent struggles, his attempts to rip from his parents' embrace, only to scuttle backwards on his hands and try and run before Mr. Harley scooped him into his arms. Get off of me. Let me go. You assholes. Ethan kicked and screamed. He's not even my real father. Whatever he was going to say was promptly muffled by his mother. When Ethan was gone, presumably dragged to his room for a talking to, I tried to follow him. Jesse Radcliffe blocked my way, fixing me with a wide smile. This was the same guy who used to burp the alphabet. He took a step towards me, and I found myself stumbling back towards the pool edge. He's fine, Jesse said. Ethan is just in a timeout, right? I said, well, I just want to talk to him. He blocked my way again. His parents are dealing with him. The boy slowly cocked his head, his gaze drinking me in, as if for the first time. When is your birthday again, Ruby? He asked casually. I tried to sidestep away from him, but Eris was behind me, his breath tickling my neck. These were my friends. But why was I so fucking scared of them? Why, no matter how hard I tried, couldn't I recognize their eyes? It's in 2 weeks. I managed to get out. You should know that. Jesse nodded slowly, his smile widening. I'm excited, he murmured. Jesse had zero concept of personal space, stepping closer, despite just a few months ago, complaining that I gave him eyesores. He was joking. Jesse and I were like brother and sister. When we played video games, he tugged out my controller so I couldn't join in. Looking at him now, he was a stranger with my friend's face, a grinning NPC staring straight through me. Jesse lifted his glass, as if saluting my upcoming birthday too. There's nothing better than seeing a girl blossom into a young woman. Definitely not something Jesse would ever say, unless he had substantial brain damage. I had an idea. It was a stupid idea, but it was an idea. Instead of responding to that, I grabbed his arm and tugged him into the hallway. To my surprise, he followed me. Do you know when we, hooked up in the back of your dad's car? I whispered. His expression crumpled with disgust, but he nodded. Yes, of course I do. I'm pregnant, I whispered, and it was when his eyes flew open in terror, and he stumbled away, quickly excusing himself, that I knew I wasn't talking to Jesse Radcliffe. Jesse is gay, still in the closet, and would rather commit seppuku, his words, not mine, than be intimate with any female, let alone me. I could sense phantom bugs filling my mouth. What the actual fuck? I wouldn't put anything past our close-knit tiny community, which thrived on youth. The parents seemed more excited than the kids themselves over turning 18. I spent the rest of the party sitting on the edge of the pool waiting for Ethan to come back. I had a conceptual plan. When he did come back, we were going to get the fuck out of town and start a new life somewhere else. Party guests started to leave, the sky above me darkening. I was watching the sunset, pretty streaks of red and orange, when Mom came to give me a slice of birthday cake. I threw it in the pool when she wasn't looking. I kept expecting Ethan to plunk down next to me, but he didn't. I figured the boy was on an indefinite grounding, at least until he left for college. Mom was still talking to Ethan's friends, and there was no sign of the birthday boy or his parents. I jumped up, shivering, and headed back into the house, slipping through the sliding glass doors. The kitchen was a mess, and I snatched up a plastic cup of orange vodka, downing it. I was busy staring at the cracked wallpaper when a sudden shriek rattled my skull. Ethan. Before I could stop myself, I followed his cries through a door I didn't recognize, which led me onto a long white hallway. This part of the Harley household felt cold, almost sterile, untouched. Ethan, I whispered, cringing when my voice echoed. There was a door at the end of the hallway, and something was pulling me toward it. I remember it feeling narrow, almost otherworldly. I took slow steps, dragging my fingers down the pale white walls. I remember disliking the texture. It was too clinical, fake, even like venturing down the hallways of an emergency room. When I peeked through the gap in the door, the first thing I saw was red, everywhere. It was wet on the floor, pooling between my bare toes. The room was too white, with bright lights shining in my eyes. I don't think I had fully registered the wet warmth between my toes and trickling through the gaps in the floor tiles at that point. I took a single step forward, blinking rapidly. Ethan was strapped to a scary-looking metal bed. Ruby. His voice was more of a breath. I heard both relief and terror. "You shouldn't be here." He let out a wet-sounding sob, wrenching at Velcro restraints, and I could see him trembling. I took another step like my body was in control of my mind. I might have been screaming, but I couldn't hear anything. All I could hear was the wet-sounding drip of Ethan's blood hitting the floor. The red was coming from him, slicking his skin like paint. Initially, I thought Ethan really was scared of being an adult. He was so scared, in fact, that he had tried to hurt himself. I could see the claw marks from his own nails, his teeth trying to tear into his own skin. But Ethan looked strangely calm, like he was meditating. He twisted his head, and I noticed straps pinning his shoulders to the table. "Can you do me a solid and grab a scalpel?" I found my voice, standing on my tiptoes to grasp for one on the top shelf above him. In person, I hesitated, but inside, my mind was screaming. When I tried to cut the restraints pinning his ankles, he shook his head violently. "No, that's not what I meant. Please kill me," he whispered in a hysterical giggle. When I checked his eyes, his pupils were huge, dilated. "What did your parents do to you?" I managed to choke out. I was met with a giggle. "Parents?" he scoffed. "They're not my parents. More like my great, 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 great." Footsteps sounded, and I slammed my hand over his mouth. Someone was coming. Ethan was still giggling to himself, muttering, "Great, great, 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 great," into my hand. Looking for an escape, there was none. The only place I could hide was... I panicked, dropping to my knees and crawling under the bed. Ethan somehow caught hold of himself, sobering up at the sound of his mother's heeled footsteps closing in on us. "Ruby." His voice spluttered into a helpless sob that broke my heart. "Get the fuck out of here. I don't want you to see this." I wanted to, but the door was already opening and then slamming shut. I glimpsed 2 pairs of shoes, heels and white Converse smeared with dirt. I recognized those shoes, though I wasn't sure where from. "Please, Mom." Ethan's voice was a whimper. "Please don't fucking do this to me." Mrs. Harley's heel clack sent chills spiking through me. In 4 steps, she was hovering over her son, and I found myself scooching back. Something hit the floor with a loud clang, and I had to bite back a cry, my mouth filling with blood when I bit through my tongue. The scalpel. Mrs. Harley's chuckle was unreal. "Ethan, sweetie, you know I'm not your mother. I have never seen you as a son." "Derek." Ethan spoke through his teeth. "Jesse fucking hated you." It was Jesse's laugh that sent my thoughts into a whirlwind. "Thank you." Jesse snorted. "I wasn't particularly fond of the boy either." "Ethan, that's rude," Mrs. Harley hissed. "Be nice to your friend." "He's not my..." Ethan burst into sobs, the bed rattling with the force of his squirming. "Mom, please don't do this." The sudden screeching sound of blades was so deafening that I slapped my hand over my mouth, muffling a cry. Ethan let out a single piercing wail, as if he was trying to cry out, before he just stopped. Everything about him stopped. His sharp, panting breaths and his violent struggling. I thought Mrs. Harley had shown mercy, had come to her senses. But then, it started to rain inside the white room. Ethan Harley had gone deathly silent. It was just a wet spot on my forehead. At first, I swiped at it, and my hand was bright red. My brain processed slower than my body. Blood. When I realized what was raining from the sky, or in my case, pooling over the edge of Ethan's bed, the shrieking screech of blades started up again. The noise was so loud, ringing in my skull, I thought it would never stop. Half aware, I clawed at my face to muffle my own hysterical shrieks. I don't know why I couldn't move. I froze, paralyzed, watching fleshy white strips of flesh and hair dropping into rapidly spreading red stretching across the floor. My stomach was twisting and turning, my mouth filling with bile. When the blade stopped, I was sitting very still, my eyes full of bright red. I barely noticed that I was soaked in blood. It was dripping in thick rivulets down my face, warm and wet and utterly grotesque. I don't think I'll ever forget that sensation. Ethan was in my mouth, in my eyes, running down my chin. I couldn't move, my knees pressed to my chest, vomit staining my shirt. "Hello, sweetie." Ethan's mother's voice slowly pricked something inside me. I didn't know I had my eyes squeezed shut until gloved hands' fingers were wrapping around my ponytail and yanking me from my hiding spot. I kept my eyes shut, clenching them against the tears, trying to tug away from her, my mouth full of stale barf. When I was politely placed in a plastic chair, I sensed Mrs. Harley crouched in front of me. Her breath tickled my cheeks. "Ruby, you can open your eyes," she hummed. "I've cleaned everything up." I did, against my better judgment. Prying open my eyes, I was suddenly aware of Mrs. Harley swiping at my face with tissue paper. Behind her was what I was trying to escape, trying to pretend didn't exist. But he was still there, reduced to a limp body covered with a white sheet, his hand hanging off of the surface. When his fingers twitched, suddenly, something acrid filled my mouth. "All better." Mrs. Harley straightened up, fixing me with a wide smile. "Now, I know you have questions, and all will be answered in due course. But right now, I have a surprise for you." The woman turned around and pulled a paper party hat from her pocket, before placing it on my head. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I was still watching Ethan's blood fill the gaps between the floor tiles. "Happy early birthday, Ruby." I started to jump up, adrenaline driving me to my feet. But then Mom walked in. I screamed for her, immediately wanting my mother. But her wide, satisfied smile only sent me into hysteria. Mom's gaze flicked to Ethan's body. "You were careful with the body, correct?" "Of course I was," Mrs. Harley said, pulling me to my feet to another empty bed. She slammed me down, pinning my wrists and ankles. "Michael is just resting, Iris. He'll be up and about in no time, do not worry." Mrs. Harley nodded to my mom, who rolled her eyes like a teenager. "Go and get yourself prepared. I will be ready when you are." Mom scoffed. "Oh, please," she said. Derek waited 3 days before his rebirth into his little brat. Mom started towards me, her face growing monstrous, her eyes flicking up and down my struggling body. This thing had been wearing my mother for as long as I'd known her, and all that time I was nothing but her end goal. "I've waited so long," she hummed, pulling at her own cheeks. Inside this ancient, stretchy trash bag, she prodded at my face with her manicure. "I want to watch it happen." Mrs. Harley hesitated, before nodding, pulling on fresh gloves. "Of course, Iris. I won't describe what my mother did to me, because it fucking hurts. What I do remember is her savage grin when spinning blades started up. I was too choked up to scream. My body was stuck, paralyzed. But before those blades could rip me apart, turning me into a second skin, both my mother and Mrs. Harley hit the ground. Before I knew what was happening, Ethan was looming over me, a metal tray in his hands. He was covered in blood, still dressed in the blue scrubs he died in. His hair had been shaved off, leaving him with bald, rugged skin held together by stitches. Ethan blinked rapidly, the tray slipping from his fingers. He looked confused, slowly inclining his head, before grabbing a scalpel. For a moment, it looked like he was going to drag it across his own throat. It wasn't Ethan. He cut through my restraints with trembling hands. I jumped off the bed, reaching to grab him and pull him with me, only to find, to my confusion, that he was kneeling on the floor, helping his mother stand. He didn't even look at me, wrapping his arms around his psychotic mother. When he did lift his head, his lip was curled in disgust, eyes narrowed into slits. "Sweetie," Ethan shook his mother. "Honey, she's getting away." I had half a mind to finish my mother off right then and there, but I got out of there. Eris Morris stepped in front of me, and I saw it, straight away. How did I never see it? Stitches, just below his hairline. So subtle, but right there. I couldn't control myself, quickly shoving past him and running, as fast and far as my feet could take me. I realized that day that Eris and Jesse weren't just dead. They were hollow skins filled with monsters. Once I was far away from the Harley household, I hid under an old bridge for 3 days. I stole Mom's car with the intention to get the fuck out of Dodge. I got all the way to the intersection leaving town before headlights were blinding me. I expected the cops, or worse, my mother herself, hunting me down for what she thought was hers. But when Ethan Harley stumbled out of his car, I think something inside me snapped in two. It was his expression. He looked like Ethan again, wide frightened eyes blinking at me. But I could also see the stitches under thick brown wig, marking him as one of them. In my mind, there was zero way my neighbor, my best friend, could survive that. I had come prepared, obviously. I didn't know how to use it, but it was just point and shoot, right? I pulled out my mother's gun, pointing it right between the boy's unfocused eyes. "Why are you here?" was all that I could choke out. He shrugged. "I don't know." He kept blinking, like he was genuinely confused. "I was in my backyard planting flowers." His face crumpled. "And now I'm standing here." His words took me off guard. I tightened my fingers around the gun, struggling with the trigger. "What did your birthday candles taste like?" I demanded. Ethan looked confused, his lips curling into a smile. "What?" I swallowed a shriek. "Your birthday candles. What did they taste like?" "Rainbows," Ethan said, and when I found myself fingering the trigger, he flinched, throwing his hands up. "Like fucking rainbows," he corrected himself. "Jesus, Ruby, can you please put the gun down?" I did, letting harsh metal slip through my fingers. "I don't have time to explain," he said. I noticed he was keeping his distance. "But I can get you away from your mom." I didn't realize I was trembling until I was on my knees, my throat clogged with sobs. "How did you find out?" I spoke to the ground, my chest aching. It wasn't Ethan, but it was also was. Ethan's small smile crumpled, and he lowered his hands. "I snuck into Jesse's house on his brother's 18th birthday, he said shakily. It started to rain, and I could barely feel it dampening my hair, sticking my clothes to my skin. Ethan stepped closer to me. When we were face to face, he prodded the scar that monster gave me. "There were 4 of us, and..." His voice shook. "We saw everything." Ethan pretended to fold his arms across his chest, but I could see him trembling. "We were 15. He heaved out a breath. "So, we dedicated every year following to escaping this fucking town." Something in his eyes turned dark, a shiver sliding down my spine. "But, he shot me a watery smile. That didn't happen." Ethan gestured to his car. "He told me he was going to take me to a safe place. When I jumped into the passenger seat, there was a gun sticking from the glove compartment. But I knew it wasn't for me." I didn't question his jerking head, or his hands slick with blood wrapped around the steering wheel, every time he gingerly stroked the stitches still lining his forehead. He wasn't stable. I could tell by the way his body moved, like he was fighting his own limbs. But that didn't stop him shooting me a small grin and cranking up the radio, singing along to Fall Out Boy. I found myself relaxing in my seat, my eyes flickering, sleep finally biting me. But sitting there against the backdrop of a rainy evening, I finally let myself sleep. I was hesitant at first, but his hand found my arm. It was warm. It's okay. Ethan's voice was a low murmur. You can sleep. When he pulled up at a hotel, Ethan tried to drive away. But I was pretty sure he was trying to get rid of the monster inside his head. I told him to stay with me, and if his behavior turned erratic, I promised I would shoot him. The good news is, we've had Ethan's parents' cash to afford us being on the run. I got a card through the mail and I knew exactly what it was. I don't know how she's found me. Maybe Ethan didn't murder his father after all. The birthday card was homemade, covered in glitter. Happy birthday, my dearest Ruby. I'm sure by now you should be feeling the effects of being so far away from me. I think we both know I deserve what is mine. I have waited 18 years, sweetheart. Do not make me come and get you myself. You have until your birthday eve, darling. Then I will be taking matters into my own hands. Can't wait to see you again. So much love, Mommy. Ethan tore up the cards and burned them. He stays up all night with a baseball bat to protect us. I'm turning 18 next week, and I'm starting to understand what Mom wrote. I've mostly been couch crashing, lying about my age and trying to finish my senior year. But over the last few days, weeks, maybe, it's like my body is rejecting me. It took me an hour to get out of bed, to even open my eyes, despite my brain being wide awake. My body is getting worse. I woke up this morning, and I can't eat anything. My arms are aching even fucking typing this. Fuck. It's like my body is screaming at me. I keep throwing up, and every time, it feels like my body is rejecting me. All of me. We're moving tonight, but I don't think I'm going to get far when I can barely stand. What should I do? Do we go home and face this thing with my mom's face, or run and let my own body drain me of my strength? Ethan called me Ruby Songbird this morning. I know I promised him, but I can't shoot him. I can't shoot the only person I have left. I love him too much, but I can't let him lead her to me either. Please help me. Edit. Another card came. This time, she's intentionally naming establishments near us. Mom knows exactly where we are.